At exactly 10:02 a.m. local time on November 2nd, 2025, a cold wind swept across a remote, concealed launch site on the edge of Mykolaiv Oblast as the Ukrainian strike crew completed their final checks. The entire loading sequence for the mission had finished flawlessly. Two Flamingo-class cruise missiles, sleek, steel gray, and deadly, now stood locked into launch position. Each carried a warhead weighing more than 2,200 pounds, equipped with an advanced inertial navigation system, terrain-hugging software, and robust anti-jamming packages. Their mission was nothing short of strategic: to destroy the Tuapse oil export port, one of Russia's most vital economic arteries, a deep-water facility pumping out more than $6 billion a year in crude. Every barrel that moved through it fed a war-strained, sanction-gutted Russian economy struggling to keep its invasion alive. A strike here would not merely hit infrastructure, it would strike at the Russian war budget itself, a blow aimed directly at Moscow's ability to sustain combat operations. Inside the Ukrainian command center, dimly lit and lined with monitors, live feed from a Beaver-class reconnaissance UAV illuminated the main display. The drone hovered far above the massive distillation columns, storage tanks, and manifold pipelines of the Tuapse port complex. The facility was operating at maximum capacity, pumping nearly 250,000 barrels of oil per day through its pipes and loading arms. Workers and guards moved about unaware that the night ahead would bring devastation unlike anything the port had ever faced. Within minutes, the pipelines carrying crude would become conduits of fire and death, and the two Flamingo missiles, soon to be airborne, would not be traveling alone. They were the killing edge of a carefully orchestrated operation. Once launched, the Flamingo missiles would require approximately 32 minutes to reach their target, more than enough time for Russian radar to detect and potentially intercept them. Ukraine had calculated every variable, knowing that a direct cruise missile approach would almost certainly fail. That was why the first phase of the operation had begun hours earlier. At 12:35 a.m., from a camouflaged mobile launcher on the Kherson front, 12 UJ-22 drones rose quietly into the night. They moved in a wide, dispersed pattern, flying low, never climbing above 165 feet, skimming the western coastline near the Tuapse complex. Their mission was dual in nature: reconnaissance and sacrificial diversion. They were kamikaze drones designed not just to strike, but to create chaos, confusion, and most importantly, to absorb the full attention of Russian air defenses. If they succeeded, the Flamingo missiles would be flying through airspace softened, distracted, and riddled with blind corridors. By 1:15 a.m., the swarm of UJ-22s completed their approach arc and entered the air defense coverage zone around the port. At a distance of 23 miles from the target, faint red blips flickered onto the radar screen inside Tuapse Coordination Center. At first 3, then 5, until the entire southwest quadrant glowed with 12 faint signatures drifting across the coastal approaches in a fan-shaped formation. Their radar cross-section, between 0.08 and 0.1 square meters, placed them below the typical alert threshold for cruise missile threats. The duty officer, however, had grown more cautious after several costly misclassifications in recent weeks. He studied the erratic pattern with suspicion. Then, as if on cue, the blips shifted behavior. Some rose, some dipped, others veered slightly left or right. On the 1RS-2-1E radar display, their flight paths began mimicking the random motion of seabirds twisting in coastal winds, with turn angles varying 3 to 5 degrees per second. To the fatigued officer, it looked like a classic cluster of gulls caught in drafts. After exactly 4.2 seconds of hesitation, he entered the classification command: bird cluster, low priority. This mistake would cost Russia dearly. At 1:22:48 a.m., when the formation had advanced to within 9 miles of manifold pier number 4, a secondary radar, the 1RS-21ER, finally gained a stable reflective cycle. Its AI algorithms immediately reclassified the objects: UAV, tactical class, low RCS. The alarm shrieked through the Panzer cabin. Without waiting for higher authorization, the nearby Panzer S-1 battery launched two 57E-6E interceptors. Further north, a Buck M2 battery fired 3 of its own missiles. In less than a minute, nearly $5 million worth of interceptors streaked into the night chasing drones that cost only a few $1,000s each. 4 drones were downed, 8 survived. But more importantly, the drones had already succeeded. Their radar signatures, electronic noise profiles, and the timing of defensive reactions were captured, encoded, and transmitted back to the Ukrainian strike crew. A real-time map of every blind spot, delay, and interference corridor now sat on the Ukrainian screens. The Ukrainian commander gave the launch order. A soft electronic beep sounded. The hydraulic lift raised the first Flamingo missile, rotating it into a 28-degree launch angle, optimized for low-altitude cruise. Seconds later, the missile shot off the rail in near silence, carving a thin white trail into the night sky as it dove towards southern Crimea. The second followed moments later. Both maintained a razor-sharp altitude of 85 feet, traveling at roughly 550 miles per hour, skimming contour after contour as they slashed southward along pre-calculated terrain features. Meanwhile, at the Tuapse port's southern piers, the night shift continued as usual. At Pier 167, the largest crude receiving zone, 2 tankers waited to take on their final loads: the Liberian-flagged MT Chai and the Bahamian-flagged Coastbuster. Beside them, the Pollock, flagged under Panama, sat idle, awaiting its turn. Together, the tankers formed a cluster of valuable targets worth hundreds of millions. At 1:23:24 a.m., the remaining 8 UJ-22 drones closed in on the southern pier, flying within yards of the concrete edge. All had passed through the last defensive layer. Each drone carried a 7.7-pound, high-explosive incendiary warhead capable of piercing thin steel and causing secondary ignition. When their infrared cameras detected stable heat signatures with over 98% certainty, they switched automatically into kamikaze mode. The first drone smashed into the high-pressure manifold cluster feeding crude to the deep-water berth. The explosion ruptured the manifold instantly, sending a jet of flaming oil spraying beneath MT Chai's hull. A sheet of fire raced down the pier. Drone 2 obliterated the foam system control shed, taking the entire firefighting grid offline in a single blow. Drone 3 hit the electrical dispatch cabin, knocking out every SCADA sensor and heat flow control line. Drone 4 ruptured the flexible transfer hose on the Pollock. Crude poured across the pier and ignited. Drone 5 detonated beneath Pier 167's deck, cracking the concrete and destabilizing the pier. Drone 6 hit an auxiliary chemical module, triggering an invisible blue-white blaze that firefighters would struggle to identify. Drones 7 and 8 were intercepted, but the damage had already turned the pier into a hellscape of fire, smoke, and cascading oil. The tankers themselves, however, remained intact, because they were not the drone's primary targets. They were reserved for the Flamingo missiles now seconds away. Inside the Russian Air Defense Center, operators suddenly noticed 2 faint radar returns slicing through the smoke at a shallow angle. They scrambled to respond, but the nearest Panzer battery had exhausted its missiles fighting the drone swarm. The TOR-M 2-unit north of the port could not rotate in time, and the Book battery never received targeting coordinates. The air defense grid hadn't failed to detect the missiles. It had simply run out of weapons. At 1:23:49 a.m., Flamingo 1 and Flamingo 2 began their terminal dive at more than 528 miles per hour. On the thermal feed from the Ukrainian UAV circling high above, 2 streaks of orange light tore across the burning pier. Flamingo 1 skimmed past MT Chai, angling directly into the connector hub feeding storage tank number 2. A fraction of a second later, internal pressure skyrocketed inside the tanker. A boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, BLEVE, tore the ship open from within. A blinding white fireball surged 600 feet into the sky, casting shadows across the container yard. Nearly simultaneously, Flamingo 2 dove into the aft deck of the Coastbuster, penetrating the engine compartment and detonating with catastrophic effect. Fires raced across the vessel, igniting fuel, chemicals, and auxiliary stores. Within seconds, both tankers were fully engulfed. Flames spread across the water as spilled oil ignited, turning the entire southern basin into a sheet of fire. From orbit, satellite sensors captured a massive burning scar across the bay. Within 12 minutes, the logistical backbone of the Tuapse port, Russia's primary Black Sea crude export hub, lay crippled. 2 tankers destroyed, 1 heavily damaged, manifold clusters torn apart, pipelines ruptured, pump stations disabled, and thousands of square meters of burning crude spilled across the harbor. Ukraine had spent less than $1 million. Russia had lost more than $200 million in assets and suffered a crippling temporary halt to 8.5% of its seaborne crude exports. For 36 hours, Moscow remained silent, unable to deny the satellite imagery, AIS logs, and OSINT confirmations spreading globally. The attack became a symbol of a new era of warfare, one in which precision, deception, and intelligence could allow a smaller force to outmaneuver, overwhelm, and bypass even the most advanced air defenses. From that night on, no Russian port could truly sleep again.